We'll discuss today the International Humanitarian Law. Okay? We'll discuss about the rules of war. Okay? What are the things that a soldier will do in times of crisis? That is called the International Humanitarian Law, or IHL. This pertains to the laws of war or the laws of armed conflict. It seeks to protect the victims of the armed conflicts, such as the wounded and the sick, prisoners of war, and civilians, and tries to constrain the conduct of military operations in a humanitarian fashion. Okay, so this even in war, there is also a rules that they have to obey. Sometimes this is called the Geneva Convention or the rules of war. For example, if the soldier or if the enemy raises the hand, you are not allowed to shoot them. They are considered prisoners of war. And a prisoners of war is entitled to all the rights, okay, provided for under the Geneva Convention or the International Humanitarian Law. Okay? A child soldier is actually prohibited. Okay? No child, and when we say child, it is below 18 years old to be recruited as a soldier. If you do so, you will be considered as terrorist. And you know, a terrorist is an enemy of all nations. So you are a criminal. Okay? So if you are a criminal, all states may be against you. Now, what are the sources of international humanitarian law? One, or the major part of international law is contained in the Fourth Geneva Convention of 1949. Okay? The conventions have been developed and supplemented by two further agreements. One is the Additional Protocol of 1977 relating the protection of victims of armed conflict. Okay? So, for example, a soldier should always wear a uniform to indicate their belonging. Okay? Not that if you are an enemy, you wear the uniform of your enemy. Okay? So that is not chivalric. You are an enemy, show to them that you are indeed an enemy. Not that you wear an insignia, okay, of an enemy. It is prohibited. Okay? There must be uniform to show that you are the enemy. Have you seen a soldier wearing another uniform? It's not allowed. It's prohibited under the Geneva Convention or the International Humanitarian Law. And in fact, you're not even allowed to drop a bomb where there are civilians. Soldiers are not allowed to sleep in the village. You should have a camp very far from the village, so that civilians will not become a victim of war. Now, is Philippine a party to the Rome Statute? What's the other term of Rome Statute? International Criminal Court, which defines and penalizes crimes against international humanitarian law and other crimes against humanity. Are we a party? Is Philippine a party to it, the Rome Statute, or the law that penalizes criminal acts? Are we? The answer is affirmative. Yes, we are. The Philippines acceded to the Rome Statute on August 30, 2011, and it took effect on November 1, 2011. However, the Philippines has notified the UN Secretary General of its decision to withdraw from International Criminal Court last March 14, 2018. So take note of that day when the Philippines withdraw. Okay? Who is the president at that time? November, March 14, 2018, last year. Duterte. He withdraw the being a party to the Rome Statute. So what does that mean? What is the significance of withdrawing from the Rome Statute, or we adhere to the principle that if you committed a crime, you are bound by the laws of nations. What would be the significance of that? When the Philippines is now withdrawing from the Rome Statute, or the law that penalizes criminal acts. Okay? So according to Rome Statute, a state party withdraw from the ICC can only take effect a year after a written notification of the withdrawal is received by United Nations Secretary General. So what is the significance? It withdraws. When is it? When does the Philippines withdraw from the Rome Statute? March 14, 2018. But according to the UN Secretary General, it will only take effect after 1 year. So meaning, after it was received, 1 year thereafter, that is the effectivity. So until now, what is the date today? October 2000. So meaning it is now withdrawn, effective after 1 year. Okay. Now, what is Martin's clause? Martin, spelling is Martens. A clause reads as follows: in cases not covered by the protocol, by other international agreements, civilians and combatants remain under the protection and authority of the principles of international law derived from established customs, from the principles of humanity, and from the dictates of public conscience. So, Martin's clause simply means that even in times of war, civilians and military or combatants remain under the protection of the authority. Okay? So, when you say war, it doesn't mean you have all the rights, absolute right to do whatever you want, because there is no law. Okay, presumably, but you know, it from now there is actually a law. Okay, when you carry a gun, there is actually a law that is effective. Okay, so it's false to say that in war there is no rules. There is still a rule. Okay, like a child soldier is prohibited. Okay, if you recruit, like for example, the New People's Army are now recruiting minors, they can be considered as what? Terrorists. Terrorists. Okay, because there is a law still on armed conflict. Okay, what is the effect if you don't follow the rules? You will be considered as, of course, terrorists, and any country that is against you can ask help from another country, and of course they are always on your side. Now, this clause, okay, the Martin's clause, should be understood as an instrument, okay, for the protection of every human being, and the acknowledgement that although humanitarian positive norms are advanced, they hardly may be considered fully complete. Okay? So even if there is a war, or there is a rules of war, still civilians and combatants are still entitled to a humanitarian law. Okay? The Martin Clause must be observed by all states whether or not they have ratified the conventions that contain them, because they constitute intransgressible principles of international customary law. Okay? So this is part of international customary law. What does that mean? It is part of a custom, which is actually a root or a source of international law. It is just a custom that is applied to all countries, which forms part of an international law. Okay, that is called the Martens Clause. Now, what is a concept of war? What do you understand about war? Others said that war is actually necessary in order to attain peace. Okay? After war, there is peace, right? And later on, there will be war. And afterward, there will be again peace. It's a cycle of life. Okay? So in conflict, as we know, there is progress. Okay? You cannot attain peace. You cannot attain what is right when no one is opposing it. Okay? In Karl Marx's theory, it is called the conflict theory. You cannot see progress unless somebody is at the opposite side. By then, is the time that you can see whether you are at the what you are doing is correct. Okay, this applied even in other countries that there should be a leftist or rightist. The leftist is always against government. That's how we understand left leftist here. Okay, in the Philippines we have groups. They call themselves as leftists. Normally they come from a labor group because Marx, who is leftist, who advocate this one, um, gives right to workers. Okay, so Marx actually believed that they in conflict there is progress, and that is what you can see in all countries. That there are factions. Okay, because in faction there where you can see what you are doing is actually right. Okay, no one can check if there's nobody at the opposite side telling you you're wrong. Okay, so what is the concept of war? War is a contention between two or more states through their armed forces for the purpose of overpowering each other and imposing such condition of peace as the victor pleases. Okay? So, if you are a winner in a war, then there will be peace. And you maintain that peace. Okay? What is an armed conflict? An armed conflict exists whenever there is a resort to armed force between states or protracted armed violations between governmental authorities and organized armed groups or between such groups within a state. Okay? So it could be within, not only between states, it could be a conflict within, meaning authorities against groups that is against the government within a state. Example, the presence of a militant group in southern Mindanao in the Philippines. Okay? Or the presence of the leftist wing. Okay? The armed group of the NPA, the CPP or Communist Party of the Philippines, which is the MPA. Okay? So, a conflict of that is within. Now, what are the qualifications of a belligerent force in a civil war? What do you mean by belligerent force? Okay, this is a group that seeks recognition in the international bodies or organizations. If they are recognized, they're entitled to such protection. If they are recognized as a legitimate belligerent group, to be legitimate, of course, they should follow the Geneva Convention on or the rules of war. Okay, and if they are recognized as a belligerent group, what rights can they get? All the rights similar to a state. And what is that? Protection from the United Nations. Okay? Now, so under Article 1 of the Hague Regulation of 1907, the qualification to be belligerent, one is must be commanded by a person responsible for his subordinates. Okay? It must be commanded by a person responsible to his subordinates. Because if there are acts of the subordinates under his command, he is entitled to a command of responsibility. Okay? A command of responsibility applies to soldier. Okay? That the acts of subordinates is also the acts of the superior. Okay? So whatever actions of the subordinate is attributed to the leader. If they kill, if the subordinate kills, okay, with the authority of the of the commander, then the commander will be held responsible of the acts. Okay? That is called the command responsibility. Okay? By the way, that principle also applies to employees in the government. If one is the superior and then the acts of the subordinate is in accordance with the direction of the superior, then his acts can be attributed to the acts of his superior. Then he cannot be sued. Okay? Take note, if it is in accordance with the authority given to you, your actions cannot be sued. Okay? The assumption is that, of course, we know that state cannot be sued. Similar to an employee working in government who acted within the limits of their responsibility cannot be sued. Except when that subordinate acted alone, which is not in accordance with the direction given to him by superior, and in bad faith, then he will be held responsible solely over his acts. Cannot be attributed to the principle of command responsibility. Okay? So that command responsibility specifically applies to soldiers. But in some cases, that may be applicable to subordinates and superior in the government. Now, what is the second qualification to be a belligerent force? They must have fixed distinctive emblem recognized at a distance. Okay? So at far, they must be recognized that they are that group. Okay? Example, wearing a black uniform or wearing of a headband. Okay, red headband to signify that you are the enemy or that is your group. Okay, not that you are the enemy but you wear the uniform of a military. That is you will not be recognized as a belligerent group. Okay? Second or third rather, they must carry arms openly. Okay? So they have to show themselves that they are soldier of the opposite side by carrying a gun. Okay, maybe a uniform gun like AK-47. Okay? Huh? Permit to carry, they are enemy. Should they get, they will not be given surely. Okay? This because it's actually illegal in themselves because they are not enemy, then it's necessary for them to prove that they are enemy that they can carry a gun. But it would be ironical if they get that permit from the PNP and they are the enemy of PNP. Of course, PNP will not give them permit. Right? Okay? You can, but they are enemies. They are enemies. They are not bound by specific rules now of ordinary penal law because they claim themselves to be an enemy now. Okay? But that doesn't mean that they can do everything. Okay? Only in terms of war, maybe they will be exempt as necessary to carry out their objectives. Otherwise, they cannot carry their objective if they follow all the rules. Okay? Now, we go to the fourth. They must conduct their operations in accordance with the laws and customs of war. Okay? So, they must conduct, okay, in their operations with the laws and customs of war. Example, okay? Of course, the one I told you, they cannot sleep in the village where there are civilians. They should have a camp very far from the village so that in case of conflict, civilians will not become the atrocities. And it will be unfair on the part of civilians who are not part to the conflict and later on they will become a victim. Okay? Now, what is retortion? Okay? What is retortion? Retortion consists in relation where the acts complained of do not constitute legal ground of offense, but rather in the nature of unfriendly acts done primarily in pursuance of a legitimate state interest, but indirectly hurtful to other state. Did you get the meaning? In other words, it's not actually illegal. The acts done is not illegal per se, okay? But it is just an act which is unfriendly. Okay? Can you give an example? of act which is not illegal and yet it is unfriendly. Okay? For example, there are um, enemy asking your help and you give help. Okay? Maybe it may not be illegal but it may be considered unfriendly. Okay? In criminal law, there is a penalty for that actually. Okay? In some instances, if it's not unfriendly, it may constitute a crime actually. And what is that crime? Treason. Treason. Or what? Violation of neutrality. Example, a violation of neutrality or provoking war. For example, some Filipinos, okay, claim that they own Sabah. Have you heard of that? The Kiram. And then they go to Malaysia to claim their right alone without asking help from Philippine government. That act may constitute a crime of what? Okay? Unsa man? What crime they may be committed? Okay? Provoking war with other country. Okay? Or you commit a crime of a possible reprisal of other country. They may retaliate. Their acts may constitute a retaliation of of that country to the entire Philippine as a state. Okay? So, when you say retortion, it is not criminal, but it may be an unfriendly act done primarily pursuant of a legitimate state interest. Okay? Resort to retortion is chiefly had a reaction to discriminatory tariff. Okay? Domestic legislation against aliens. For example, you craft a law that will punish other state. Okay, instead of a tax which is lower, you impose a higher tax of the commodity of other country. It is not illegal, but it may, that acts done may constitute to be unfriendly. What is reprisal? The one I told you, I mentioned this one already. Subject to a reprisal. What is reprisal then? R-A-P-R-I-S-A-L. What is that? Okay. Literally means denotes the seizing of property or persons by way of retaliation. Okay. So, this is what you do. So all we have to do as act a violation to our sovereignty, we're going to attack also your country. Okay, that is reprisal. Reprisal, when they are taken by a state, may denote a kind of coercive action. Okay, not amounting to war, whereby a state attempts to secure satisfaction from another for some wrong which the latter has committed against it. Okay, so reprisal, it simply means a retaliation. What is ceasefire? Ceasefire. In our country, you know that sometimes, although they are enemies, but they declare ceasefire. Okay, let's stop first, especially during Christmas. Okay, so we are enemy, but this Christmas season we are not enemy at this moment. But after Christmas, we resume war. Okay, we have that. Okay, they declare normally ceasefire every now and then. Okay, so but when they declare ceasefire, doesn't mean that they have to rest themselves and ask for enforcement. Okay, sometimes that's what other enemies are doing. They declare ceasefire, and at that time when they had ceasefire, that's the time that they ask for support from other countries. What is ceasefire? It is agreed cessation, local or general, of the fighting within a period of armed conflict. Okay, it is allowed. It is allowed to declare a ceasefire. It does not necessarily terminate the armed conflict existing between the belligerents, either de jure or de facto. Okay? So it's just a temporary cessation of the armed conflict. It does not cease the entire armed conflict. What are the two divisions of the laws of war? Okay. First is hus ad bellum and hus in bello. What is that? What does that mean? Okay. Hus ad bellum refers to the conditions under which one may resort to war or to force in general, with a subdivision known as hus contra bellum, or the laws of on the prevention of war. Okay? So condition under which one may resort to war or force in general. Okay? So ad bellum. How about hus ad bellum governs the conduct of belligerent during war? Okay? The first is condition under general force in general. Okay, to declare war. Another one, jus bello, in bello, the conduct of belligerent during war. In a broader sense, comprises the rights and obligation of the neutral parties as well. Okay, so jus in bello refers to conduct, the conduct. Jus ad bellum refers to the condition. Okay. Now, I've mentioned that international humanitarian law, okay, is almost actually similar to rights, the rights or the human rights, right? Would appear to be similar. Of course, there is a distinction. Okay, what's the other term for international humanitarian law? Okay, the Geneva Convention, Rome Statute. What's the other term? International Criminal Court. Okay, very good. Now, what's the distinction between international humanitarian law and international human rights law? Okay, so the nature. Okay, first, when we say international humanitarian law, covers all rules protective of potential or actual victims of armed conflicts, all the rules of conduct of warfare, and all the provisions relating to the rights and duties of the armed forces towards the other party in case of armed conflict. We call it as the international humanitarian law as its nature. How about the international humanitarian rights law? What does that mean? It encompasses all fundamental freedoms and all the basic social, economic, and cultural rights recognized by individual independently of nationality. So in other words, when I say international humanitarian right refers only to basic social, economic, and cultural rights. As to when it is applicable, international humanitarian law applicable in armed conflicts only, whereas international humanitarian rights law applicable in all situations, peace and war. Okay? So, international humanitarian law applies only to war, while international human rights law applies to both when there is peace or there is war, and in all places. As to purposes, okay, the international humanitarian law aims to protect people who do not or are no longer taking part in the hostilities. The rules embodied in international humanitarian law imposes duties on all parties to the conflict. Okay, while international human rights law tailored primarily for the peacetime and applies to everyone. Their principal goal is to protect individuals from arbitrary behavior of their own government. Okay, in other words, international human rights law protects the citizen both in times of peace and war. Okay, whereas in international rights, humanitarian law applies to victims or those who join the war. Now, what are the different categories of armed conflict? Okay, It may be categorized either as one, international armed conflict. What does that mean? States declaring war against another state. Another is internal or non-international armed conflict. Example, enemies of government fighting against the government, like the presence of the armed group of the Communist Party of the Philippines, the the NPA. Okay, it is a conflict within. That falls under number two, internal, meaning within the country. That's internal. And the third is wars of national liberation. Okay, if you are a state and you want to be an independent, you are still bound by that category of the armed conflict. Okay, war on national liberation. Can you give me an example of this? War on national liberation? Huh? Maybe, right? But actually, that is considered still a conflict within. When we attain our independence, June 12, when General Aguinaldo lead um, the soldiers for us to become independent, that is war on national liberation. Okay. Now, what is an international armed conflict? These are conflicts which at least two states, the one I already explained. Okay. And how about internal or non-internal conflict? Conflict which are restricted within the territory of a single state. Okay? And then how about what's the important to determine whether the conflict is international or non-international? What's the purpose of these categories? Anybody? Can you follow my discussion? Very good. You have to read in advance. Okay? Because time is running. Okay? Anyway, you have all the notes. What you have to do is to read. You have all the time in the world, not like us, not like me. My time is so limited. So, make use of the time. Do not be lazy in reading. Otherwise, you will die ignorant. Now, you should know a little of everything. It's difficult to deal with ignorant. You will be in trouble. Okay? And that cause sometimes why Philippines is poor. Because our leaders are ignorant. They are just rich people with no brain. Okay? But I'm not saying to all. It applies only to some. Because I'm going to post this one. I know some politician might be watching my video. Okay, so let's proceed. Now, what is the importance of knowing the difference of these categories? One, when I say international armed conflict are governed by the Geneva Convention and additional protocol. Okay? While the non-international conflict are governed by common article of the four Geneva and additional protocols. Okay? When if it's only within, they may be governed by the laws of the country. Okay? A conflict within. But if it is international, then it is governed by the Geneva Convention. And in fact, that's when the UN might enter into the scene. Now, what is the test for determining the existence of international armed conflict? What's the importance of this test? So that UN can intervene. Okay? There will be votes of the members of the United Nations, okay, over which side they are going to defend. Now, what is the test? The test is to determine the existence of international armed conflict is whether there is a resort to armed force between states or protracted armed violence between governmental authorities and organized armed groups or between such groups within the state. So the test is to determine whether there is a resort to armed forces. Okay? Armed force meaning the military between states or a protracted armed violence. Okay? And what is internationalized armed conflict? What do you mean by internationalized armed conflict? In case of internal armed conflict breaking out on the territory of a state, it may become an international if number one, another state intervenes in that conflict through their or its troops. Okay? So if another state, for example, conflict between China and Russia, China and Philippines, Russia would intervene in favor or to defend Russia because they are friends, they have maybe a treaty. So that will become what? An international armed conflict. Another is some of the participants in the internal armed conflict act on behalf of that other state. For example, conflict in the Philippines. This armed group that is against the Philippines. And they are now supported by Russia, for example. That will become what? An internationalized armed conflict. Okay? Now, what is war in national liberation? Okay? Okay, a conflict which peoples are fighting against colonial domination. Okay, the one I gave an example of the struggle of Aguinaldo for a Philippines to be liberated from the hands of the Spaniards. Okay, that is a war on national liberation. Okay, what is apartheid? Okay, spelling is Apartheid. Apartheid means inhumane acts committed in the context of an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination by one racial group or groups and committed with the intention of maintaining that regime. Okay? The key word there is inhuman act of a group. And what is that group? Racial group. Okay? That is apartheid. Okay, there's one I've heard. They are against one group. Okay, I think it's a Muslim group. Okay, against this group. Okay, that is called an apartheid. Others would say it's apartheid. Okay, regardless of how you pronounce it, as long as the spelling in our test is correct, that is still correct. Okay, so take note of the spelling. A followed by I, D. Now, we go to the categories or stages of challenges to establish state authority. Okay? Categories or stages are rebellion. Okay? What is rebellion? When you take up arms against the government or to take a portion of the naval forces of the Philippines to cripple the government. That is called rebellion. Okay? And then another one is insurgency. What is insurgency? Okay? A civil disturbance with the presence of the military. As opposed to the other one, it is when it is overthrowing the government by a military sweep attack, coup d'etat, co-op d'etat. Okay? It's a sweep attack with stealth to overthrow by military. And not only military, by the way, public officer against the government. That's coup d'etat. Belligerency. Okay? Belligerency, taking up arms against the existing government. You form a group. What is insurgency? Civil disturbance which actually or usually confined in a limited area of the territory of the state. Now, what is the material field of application test? Material field of application test. Under this test, a dissident armed group can claim status of insurgent only when it is under responsible command and exercises such control over a part of its territory to enable it to carry out sustained and concerted military operations. Okay? So, in other words, it is a group that is against the government. A simple group. Okay? So, a test that to determine whether you qualify as a belligerent group is called the material field of application test. Let us say there are numerous people joining the other party to fight against government. Okay, that test can become if it's numerous, which is a threat to government, then it may become a belligerent group. Okay. Now, what is belligerency? I explained that already, right? Okay, insurgents had occupied a certain part of Philippine territory, established a government, okay, with rights inherent in the sovereignty. And third, okay, they conducted the hostilities by organized groups, kept under a military discipline. Okay, they have their own soldiers. Okay, they have their own military and they follow rules of war. Then they may be called what? Belligerent or belligerency. Okay. Now, what define armed conflict under Philippine Act of Crimes against International Humanitarian Law? Okay, genocide and other crimes against humanity. When you say armed conflict, it means that any use of force or armed violence between states or protracted armed violence between governmental authorities. Okay? So what do you mean by genocide? What is genocide? Killing of huh? ethnic groups. Okay? Not the killing of the genes. Okay, when you say side killing, right? I remember a story in a law school. The professor asked, um, you know, when you say side, like suicide, so is self, side killing. Insecticide, killing of an insect. The professor asked, what's the difference between murder and homicide? Okay? Simple. With the presence of the aggravating circumstances like treachery or fraud, then that is murder. How about homicide? He said homicide is when the killing is inside the home. It's homicide. When the killing is inside the home, it's homicide. That's wrong. That's wrong. A mere killing itself without the attendance of the six aggravating circumstances such as treachery, okay, fraud, use of um, weapons, okay, that is murder. Okay, in the absence of the sixth element, that the crime is just homicide. Now, what is meant by attack directed against any civilian population? Very crucial. Take note, if it is proven that the attack is directed against the civilian population, there will be liability. But how? What's the meaning of that? It means the course of conduct involving the multiple commission of the acts referred to against any civilian population pursuant to the furtherance of a state or organizational policy to commit such attack. For example, the missile is dropped within the vicinity of the village of the civilians. Then that is considered attack against a civilian population. So if it is directed towards the civilian, then that person who directs such act will be liable as for violation of International Humanitarian Law or the Geneva Convention. So, for example, you know the coverage of the wide range of the diameter or radius of a bomb, right? If you are an expert, you should know the radius. Okay, you should know where it will hit, given the trajectory and the degree radioed to you by those in the battlefield. Okay, do you know what I'm talking to or what I'm talking about? Of course, they communicate. Or actually, when there is a war, there is a navy out there, a gun pointing already. Okay, in the area where you are fighting. Okay, probably at the exact location where you are or where the enemy is located. Okay, they give you coordinates. This is the coordinates. This is where you drop the bomb. Okay, okay. If you know the way it will be located, where is the target given the project trajectory? Okay, trajectory meaning the way it should hit. Okay, where the bullet uh, will be dropped and the range that it will cover. Okay, and if you know that civilians will be affected, then you will be held liable. Okay, making it sure that during war, no civilians will be affected. Okay, that's the rationality. Now, what is the meaning of or who is horse D combat? Horse HORS. Na the word DA combat COMBAT. What is horse D combat? It is the power of an adverse party. Power of the adverse party. What do you mean by adverse party? Enemy. Clearly express an intention to surrender. Okay? The power of the adverse party clearly declaring to surrender. Okay? Has been rendered unconscious or had been rendered unconscious or otherwise incapacitated by wounds or sickness and therefore incapable of defending himself. What does that mean? The first is the power of an adverse party. Okay? Ang ilang kusog, whether they are capable of fighting. And the second is express the intention to surrender. If they want to surrender, okay? Because they are not capable of fighting. For example, you lose your arms. Can you fight? Two arms. Can you still fight? Okay? And then the unconscious or otherwise incapacitated. You are unconscious. You don't have consciousness. You are now sleeping, but you are alive because your heart is still beating. Okay? Or incapacitated. You become crazy because of the bombs drop every now and then. Okay? Your eardrum burst because of the explosion. Now, that you become now a horse D combat. Not horse. HORS without E. Take note of the spelling. Okay? So, if you are now, what's the term for when your limbs are in, other term for ano, cutting, amputated. If your arms are amputated, all the limbs are amputated, you cannot fight, right? Okay? So, you are useless. You are not combatant anymore. That is called forced combat. I remember the story of Waray. You know Waray? Waray? Those who are from Samar, okay, they are very, according to them, they are very brave. Okay? So, naay nagwan, away. And you know, Samarinos are used to go to the farm with bolo in their waist, tucked in their waist. So, of course, they drink, of course, tuba, right? And the reason why they are brave because when they offer a pulutan, you will not eat. and it's very difficult. It's different because they offer it to you using knife. Okay, they pick the pollutant using knife and hand it to you in your mouth. Okay, if you open your mouth, you become friends. If you don't, then the knife will be used to kill you. Okay, so nato yung nagpinsing away ang mga Samarinyo. Daghang kayong tao, away sila, proison. Pag tinigbasay, naputol ang head, the head was cut. Okay? And it rolled to the foot of an audience watching the fight. Okay? And then the head was really severed, literally severed. It rolled to the head shouted, "Dapin mo sukol pa ko." Okay? The head shouted, "Okay, stay away. I'll still fight." Okay? That proves their bravery. Okay? So, even in war, you have to be very brave. Like, you cannot declare war when you bomb first, you cripple first your enemy. That is what? Uncavalry. If you are a soldier, fight like a soldier. Okay? Like, for example, have you seen a movie? Like, if you have a gun, and then the other one is a knife, you throw the gun, then fight them with knife. That is cavalry. Okay? It is uncavalric when you shoot him, he's only using a knife. Okay? You are not a soldier. You are not a soldier in that case. Okay? Uncavalric meaning you are not a real man. Okay? If you are really man, fight like a man. Hand to hand. Okay? It is uncavalric when you drop a bomb first and then you declare war. You cripple first your enemy. You steal victory. Okay? That's the word of Alexander the Great when he was about to invade one country. His advisor said that we have to attack them at night, but Alexander the Great said, "I will not steal victory. I will fight in the battlefield." Okay, so that's cavalry. Cavalry. The spelling is yeah. You know the spelling. That's cavalry. So you should be cavalric. You cannot declare war when your enemy cannot fight anymore. That is treachery. Actually, treachery. Okay? Making it sure that the enemy will die. Okay? So when you declare war, you have to say first, we are at war before you drop a bomb. Okay? You have to use same weapon. Okay, not that you use nuclear bomb when your enemy doesn't have nuclear bomb. Okay, that is cavalry. Cavalry. Now, what is perfidy? Okay, for a beautiful woman, we'll pronounce this as perfidy. For real men, perfidy. Perfidy. Okay, it means acts which invite the confidence of an adversary to lead him or her to believe that he or she is entitled to or is obliged to accord protection under the rules of international humanitarian law, whether the intent to betray the confidence, including but not limited to, okay, feigning intent to negotiate, okay, you pretend to negotiate but you are not, okay, feigning surrender, you pretend to surrender, okay, feigning incapacitation by wounds or sickness, feigning civilian or non-combatant status, feigning protective status by the use of signs, emblems, and uniforms. Okay? So, for example, you raise a flag, a white flag. What's the meaning of that? Raising of a flag, white flag? Okay, surrender. But in the end, when you lower your gun because your enemy is now surrendering, they get the gun and open fire. Okay? That is perfidy. That is a violation. Okay? When they surrender, um, you should not pretend. Okay? What is military necessity. Okay? Now, though crimes, no, I will just jump. Almost time, so I'll stop here. The next time we discuss, we will talk about law of the sea. And that ends for today.